Hello. One of the key components of Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 is the quadratic formula. And this is the quadratic formula. You probably have seen it. It might scare you a little bit. We're going to break it down a little bit. Maybe it'll make more sense when I'm done. First of all, the quadratic formula basically finds the quadratic roots of the equation. So for instance, what I mean by that is where it crosses the x-axis. So I'm just looking for these 2 points. Just like how when you look at a quadratic equation and you see that the c right here is the y-intercept, so that would be this point right there because it has no variable with it. You'll notice that these two here I also are very critical points that I am going to need. Now you've got a couple of things going on. You've got a bunch of arches down here. I want to show you that there are real world applications for them for a quadratic equation. But more than anything, a lot of times students don't understand what they're actually looking for. And if it doesn't have an answer, so you get a negative number in the square root, so therefore you get an error message, or if you're in Algebra 2, you get an imaginary number, it means that it doesn't actually cross the x-axis. That's all it means. It's pretty simple. That means it's just kind of like somewhere up here somewhere, or maybe it's down here and it's upside down. And so that's all that means. So it's not a mystery. It just doesn't cross the x-axis, so you don't actually have a real answer. So let's break this down a little bit. You've got a couple parts going on here. Let's just take this very simple equation. And the first thing you need to realize is that A, B, and C, you have these letters A, B, and C, are basically the coefficients in front of each of these with the actual sign. So if I'm looking at this, this would be my A, this would be my B, and this would be my C. So when I'm looking at this, my A is going to be 1 because there's no number in front. B is going to be negative 3. C is negative 40. I am going to keep that sign that's in front of it. And I'm going to just replace them. So now that I know that, I'm going to say, okay, well, negative 3, because it starts with a negative, I'm just going to replace it with it. And I'm going to put this b squared minus ac all over 2a. So you can see here, you're squaring this negative. So the first number right here, I want to point something out right here, will never be negative. Because when you square a negative number, you're always going to get a positive number. So if you kind of get that through your head that there will never, ever, ever, ever be a negative number right there, that may help you a little bit when you're doing these. So when you try to put in your calculator, you don't put negative 3 squared, but you actually put 3 squared in there and just realize it's positive because negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. So that may help a little bit because a lot of times that's a big mistake students make. So the first thing I want to do is I do want to solve this right here. We call that the discriminant in Algebra 2, but right now for those in Algebra 1, it's just where it's going to help you decide whether or not it actually crosses the x-axis. If it doesn't for Algebra 1, then guess what? You're probably done. No one's going to ask you to go any further. Algebra 2, we have that scary thing called imaginary numbers. Sorry, now you have an I involved. So let's go on and see what I mean. So I'm going to go ahead and solve it. I end up getting a 9 here. And when I multiplied, sorry, I'm going to go backwards. I apologize. When I multiplied this negative 4 times this negative 40, 4 times 4 is 16, and then 4 times 40 would be 160. But this becomes positive because I have two negatives, make a positive. And of course, this also became positive. So that's where I'm getting my 9 plus 160. Got it? Hopefully that makes sense. And so I get this 9 plus 160, and I put them together. This basically ends up being the square root of 169, which then gives me 13. Now, I'm going to also turn this into positive. Hopefully you've seen this symbol before. We call this in our school Mr. Confusion, so we're going to knock him out. So maybe that'll help you a little bit. And we then divide the whole thing by 2 over 1. So we get this 3 plus or minus 13 over the square root of, or over 2. Sorry, not square root. So we've solved our square root. But a lot of times students don't really understand this plus or minus sign. And it just means you have to add and you have to subtract. That's really what it amounts to. So when I'm done with this, I have 16 over 2 and I get 8. And I'm done with this and I get 3 minus 13, which is 10, negative 10 over 2, and I get negative 5. Now, I want to make sure you understand something. There's a lot going on here. There's other parts to it as far as to get this middle part. But for right now, I need you to realize when you take this number and you multiply it by this number, you better get this number right there. Unless there's a number in front of this, you're going to get that number. Okay? So as long as I have a 1 in front, that's what I should get. Hopefully that makes sense. And that helps you with that particular formula. Now, if you need to know what happens when it doesn't have a 1 in front, like 20, let's go ahead and just keep going real quick. We would still have the same thing. A equals 20, B equals negative 93, and C equals 108. So we still have to keep the same information. It's not going to change. My A is still here, my B is still here, and my C is still here. I'm still going to run it through this formula. This will still become positive. I run this whole thing. This is still positive. Remember the 93 squared. If it's negative 93 squared, it's still negative 93 times negative 93. So obviously it's positive. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head. There is no other negative, so I am going to be subtracting these two numbers. So I'm going to run it through my calculator and go ahead and try and see if you come up with the same answer I do. And I end up with a 9. Square root of 9 is 3. So we can just change that to 3. Again, I'm looking at that plus and minus. And I have a 93 plus 3 over 40, which basically gives me 96 over 40, which when reduced is 12 over 5. I get a 93 minus 3 over 40, which is 90 over 40. And if you kind of remember your basic math, you know you can take away the zeros and you get 9 over 4. And those are my answers. And obviously if I take 12 divided by 5 and I multiply it by 9 divided by 4, I'm not going to get 108. And if you are in an upper level, you may want to have to understand this a little bit more. But I want to make sure you understand what that actually means. Remember, when you FOILed it, you got something that said x plus some number. Times x plus some number, whether it's minus or whatever. The point is you had it look like this, and they were equal to each other. So where does that come from here? Well, I just have to undo it, is per se. So how do I undo a fraction? Well, first thing I do is I multiply both sides by 5, and I get 5x equals 12. There's that one. And then I'm going to move the 12 to this side of the equation by subtracting it to both sides and getting it to equal 0. Because remember this whole thing, if no matter what, whether it's an n or an x, it's y equals that when I'm looking at the equation. The reason y equals 0 is because I'm looking for the x-intercepts. Remember, all x-intercepts are some number and 0. So in order for it to be along the x-axis, my y has to be 0. That's why your teacher continually says, hey, make sure it's equal to 0, because you're looking for the roots, the x-intercepts. And so now I have this, okay, so I have something that looks a little bit more normal, 5x minus 12. I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to multiply both sides by 4. I get 4x equals 9. I'm going to subtract 9 to both sides, and I get 4x minus 9. And lo and behold, when I put them together, I get this, which is literally what I've seen in the past. If I was to FOIL this, my first and last number, or my first number, or last number, so I'm sorry. You get your first, outer, inner, last, okay? And if I was to FOIL it, I would get this as my answer. So you're kind of doing it backwards. I mean, if you had done the foiling, you've probably done a lot of the foiling. Now you have to find the FOIL, which is factor it. So if I multiply negative 12 times negative 9, I get positive 108. And that's where that's coming from. Hopefully that helps a little bit and you understand parabolas and the equation, a quadratic formula. a little bit more.